Hi there, Staplehurst Free Church. It's great to be with you virtually this morning as you continue this series of the Big Day Out. My name is Andy Frost. I'm going to share one of my favourite stories from Scripture with you this morning. This is the story of Jesus calming the storm in Mark chapter 4. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." I don't know if you've ever been asked a really silly question. I was once playing football, went up for a header, and when I came down, I touched my head and realised that my head was bleeding profusely. I got a piece of cloth, put it on my head as blood dribbled down, went in the car and drove to the A&E. I turned up at the reception desk there, the cloth over my head, blood still gushing out. And the lady said, "Are you okay?" I said, "No, I've hurt myself." She said, "Where have you hurt yourself?" I was there covered in blood, holding this thing against my head, thinking, well, it isn't an ingrowing toenail, is it? It was a really silly question. It was obvious that I was bleeding from my head. This is where I had hurt myself. In this story, Jesus asks what seems like a really silly question. Why are you so afraid? His disciples just had this most incredible experience, this massive storm. They are drenched through. They've seen these massive waves, perhaps 20 feet high. The water pouring over into the boat. I just can't imagine what it must have been like on that big lake as all this takes place. And then Jesus says to them, "Why are you so afraid?" It seems like a silly question. It's obvious, isn't it? These disciples have come close to death. They were afraid of losing their livelihoods, of losing their lives, of these boats sinking. They were afraid of so many different things. And yet Jesus says, "Why are you so afraid?" But when Jesus asked this question, it might seem silly, why are you so afraid? But I don't think he was asking it for his benefit, but for their benefit. To ask them to think deeply about their fears. If Jesus asked you and me today, why are you so afraid? What would be some of our deepest fears? The things that keep us up at night. The thoughts we can't quite put to one side. One of the things I find fascinating about this story is that Jesus chooses to go across the lake rather than round the lake. He also doesn't pray for the storm to stop before it occurs. It's almost as if he allows the disciples to go through this difficult situation. I think I've discovered over the years that it's actually in difficult situations that we actually discover more of who God is. And it's in this story that the disciples begin to discover more of who Jesus is as they face some of their greatest fears. See, in our life, we will all face storms. Everybody faces storms. But as Christians, we also face unique storms as we share the gospel, as we challenge injustice, as we serve those who are needing. We serve in so many different ways, and there are different challenges we all face, different storms we all face. And sometimes we experience the power of God manifest. That idea of quiet, be still, and we see God intervene. It could be miraculous healing, or incredible provision, or amazing breakthrough. But sometimes God doesn't do it in that way. Sometimes God just helps us keep on keeping on. We discover the presence of God even in the storms of life. I've been reflecting a lot recently on Paul's letter to the Philippians. Paul writes to the church in Philippi, and he writes from Rome. He's in chains, under house arrest, and he's praying, but there seems to be no breakthrough. And yet he's writing to the church in Philippi, where we discover in Acts chapter 16 that he was in prison there too. He was in chains there as well. But when he prayed then, suddenly his chains came loose. The bars swung open of the prison. And yet this miraculous intervention that takes place in Philippi is not taking place in Rome. We discover that actually God is doing something different in his circumstances. The gospel is spreading. He's seeing the power of God at work, but not in his escape. Sometimes God works in the miraculous, but sometimes God just helps us continue in the here and now as we know a sense of his presence with us. He asked that first question, why are you so afraid? And then he asked the second question, do you still have no faith? Imagine being the disciples, they're drenched in this boat. It's probably still rocking side to side. The sea is now very, very still. And Jesus is standing right in front of you, basically asking the question, do you trust me? Now the disciples had already seen some incredible things. They'd seen Jesus teaching. They'd seen Jesus drive out evil spirits. They'd seen Jesus heal people. And here in this moment, they had seen him having power over the wind and the waves. And yet they still have these questions. It's maybe easy to think, well, if I was back then, if I was one of those disciples, I would have ultimate faith in Jesus. But perhaps we now have a bigger and better view than they did. You see, we know that ultimately, Jesus didn't just come to calm a storm, but he steps into human history to see the chaos and the storm all around, the evil and the injustice all around. And through his life and his death and his resurrection, we see what he achieves here on earth for each and every one of us. It's not just those words, quiet, be still, but the words, it is finished. The challenge for these two questions for me, where are my fears? What do I need to hand over to God at this time? And second of all, do I really put my trust in Jesus? I've discovered that as I look backwards at God's faithfulness over the years, I can see that he can be trusted. That in this moment, I take my eyes off my circumstance and look to him and realize that in this moment, he can be trusted. And as I look ahead, I know that ultimately in Scripture, we know how the story ends, that there is victory in his death and resurrection. And because of that, I put my trust in him. My challenge for you this morning is, what are your fears? Will you hand them over to God? And second of all, will you put your trust in Jesus?